I always thought that a normal day at work could end with anything, but not what I had to experience that evening. I stepped in for my first shift in a patrol car, working alongside an experienced detective named Jackson. He was one of those people who saw more than he wanted to, but kept his composure like no other. We received a call about a disappearance that appeared to be a routine matter. A young man, 28 years old, did not return home after going to meet an unknown seller through an ad on a website. Jackson was immediately alert, and I tried to control myself, although something inside whispered that this was not going to be just another incident. We drove to the address where we were supposed to meet the missing person, but the place looked abandoned. There was no one outside, but inside, anxiety grew with every step. Jackson looked at me, and I knew that this night would change everything. We approached a house that looked like a ghost of its old life. Boarded up windows, peeling walls, and only one old lantern that flickered as if trying to tell us something important. Jackson gestured for me to stay behind, and he confidently walked forward, carefully opening the door. The inside smelled of mold and something else, heavy and oppressive. The wooden floor creaked under our feet, creating a feeling that we were not alone. The house was empty, but not completely. Somewhere deep in my subconscious, I felt that someone or something was lurking in the darkness, and it was watching us. We went into the living room where some old newspapers were lying among the dust and dirt. Jackson picked up one of them and read the headline, "Disappearing again. The police are powerless." These words made me break out into a cold sweat. They were old newspapers, but their content reminded us of something that had happened very recently. Jackson turned sharply when he heard a sound coming from the basement. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with more than professional interest. I nodded, and we both took a step towards the door that led down into the darkness that seemed deeper than one would expect from a mere basement. We had no idea what was waiting for us behind those doors. The basement door slowly opened, making a creak that seemed to resonate in my mind. Jackson turned on the flashlight and illuminated the stairs leading down into the abyss. I could feel my heart beating faster with each step. The basement was narrow and low, and the air here was heavy, as if no one had entered here for a long time. The flashlight made out details from the darkness. Old wooden beams, broken boxes, a pile of junk. But suddenly the beam of light stopped on something that made me gasp. In the very corner of the basement, almost behind the rubble of old furniture, we saw something similar to a large chest. But the worst part was that a part of dirty clothes was visible from under its cover, which was definitely not part of the furniture. Jackson gestured for me to come closer, and we carefully opened the lid. The contents of the chest made me turn away. There was a corpse curled up in the fetal position. The man's face was contorted with fear, and his eyes were open, as if he were looking into the very heart of the horror of death. Jackson carefully examined the body and found a watch on the man's wrist with the inscription "For Ben from Laura." We realized that this was the missing man we were looking for. But what happened to him? And who is hiding in this darkness? And then we heard heavy steps on the stairs leading down. Someone or something was heading straight for us. Footsteps sounded closer and closer, and a cold fear bound me from the inside. Jackson quietly turned off the flashlight, and we stood in the dark, holding our breath, hoping we wouldn't be noticed. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought someone could hear it. The shadows on the stairs began to move, and I saw a silhouette descend. This figure was tall and thin. Its contours looked unnatural. The stranger was slowly approaching us, and I could feel the tension building. Each step of this creature seemed merciless, each sound more frightening than the last. Jackson gestured for me to move to the right, closer to the old desk in the corner. I moved carefully, trying not to make a sound, while the stranger continued to approach the casket where Ben's body lay. Suddenly, the stranger stopped, and I saw him turn his head in our direction. Although the face was in the dark, I felt that look pass through me like X-rays. I could barely keep myself from moving. The unknown person leaned towards the chest, and I heard him muttering something under his breath, words that I did not understand but which filled me with horror. He began to carefully close the chest, ignoring us as if we were not there. But just at that moment, I accidentally caught a metal can with my foot, which rolled on the floor with a thud. The silhouette suddenly raised its head and rushed in our direction. Jackson immediately grabbed my arm and pulled me into a dark corner where we tried to hide among the junk. The stranger almost felt our presence. He stopped a few steps away from us, and I heard him breathing heavily. Suddenly, he began to whisper in a voice that exuded rage, "You shouldn't have come here!" With these words, he suddenly turned and went upstairs, leaving us in the darkness of the cellar, in which the real horror was just beginning to awaken. As soon as we heard the door close above us, Jackson quickly grabbed my arm and gestured that we should get out of here immediately. He abruptly drew his gun and held it at the ready as he headed for the exit. I could feel the tension building under his skin, every muscle in his body tensed, ready for action. As we were walking up the stairs, I turned back and noticed something on the basement floor glistening. It was a small metal object similar to a pendant. I bent down to pick it up, but Jackson stopped me. "Not now. We need to get out of here," he whispered, and we continued on. Leaving the house, we wasted no time getting into the car. Jackson started the engine, but instead of moving, he thought for a moment. His eyes were directed into the distance, but it was clear that he was thinking about something important. "It's not an accident," he finally said, looking straight at me. This guy knew we were coming. He knew we'd be looking for him. I began to understand that this was only the beginning of something much bigger and scarier. Who was this stranger? Why did he leave us alive? And what did his whisper mean? We had to act quickly, but at the same moment I felt something cold touch my neck. I twitched reflexively but saw nothing. It was like the breath of death, silent, invisible, but real. Jackson started dialing a number on the phone when I heard that whisper again. Now it was closer, more obvious, and sounded no longer only in my head. He said something about darkness, about fear, about what awaits us if we continue our search. I felt my heart tighten with terror and realized that we were being persecuted, and it was something worse than anything we could have imagined. Jackson finally hit the gas and we pulled away, leaving the abandoned house behind. But the feeling that we are not alone did not leave me. The whispers I heard grew louder, almost unbearable. It mixed with the sound of the engine, and I could feel myself beginning to lose control of my thoughts. Jackson seemed to notice my condition and elbowed me in the shoulder. "Get a hold of yourself. It's just fear. It's paralyzing you. We're going to find this bastard." But as soon as he said that, I saw that something creepy appeared in the rearview mirror. It was a figure that kept at a distance, but I could clearly see its vague outline in the darkness. She followed us, staying in the shadows no matter how fast we sped up. It wasn't human, at least not like us. "Jackson, look in the mirror!" I shouted, feeling the blood pounding in my temples. Jackson looked sharply in the mirror and turned pale for a moment. He turned the steering wheel sharply, and we entered a side road, hoping to break away from the pursuer. But the figure remained behind us, as if neither speed nor obstacles touched it. She just followed, steadfast and unstoppable. "What the hell is this?" Jackson shouted, trying to find a way out, but his voice was full of fear that I had never heard in him before. The path in front of us narrowed, and the forest became more and more dense. Tree branches clung to the car as if trying to stop it. I could feel my pulse rising, and the fear became more and more intrusive. It was more than just a chase, it was a hunt. "We can't just run away!" I shouted, although I didn't know what to do next. We had to stop it, but how? What could we do against this terrifying creature that was following us? Suddenly, the figure in the mirror stopped abruptly and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Jackson stopped the car, and we were both breathing heavily, trying to understand what had just happened. "But this is not the end," I whispered, knowing that the darkness had not yet let us go, and the worst is yet to come. We sat in the car in the middle of the dark forest, trying to calm down after the chase. Although the figure was gone, the feeling of its presence remained. I looked at Jackson, and I saw determination mixed with fear in his eyes. "We can't just run away like children," he said, breathing hard. "We have to find out who it is and what they want from us." I nodded, though part of me wanted to just get out of here and never come back. But we were police officers, and it was our job to deal with such horrors, even if it was beyond the normal. Jackson got out of the car and grabbed his flashlight. I did the same, although my hands were shaking a little. The forest was quiet, too quiet for a night like this. No sound broke this dead silence, and it was more frightening than any screams. We began to move forward, lighting our way with lanterns. Every step seemed to echo in this gloom that seemed endless. I tried to keep my eyes wide open, looking for something that could explain what had just happened. Finally, among the thick thickets, we came across something strange. A small black bag tied with a rope was lying on the ground. It looked fresh, as if someone had just put it there. Jackson bent down and began to carefully untie the rope, while I held the flashlight, trying to illuminate everything around me. When the bag was opened, a small notebook fell out. I picked it up and unfolded it to look at the pages. They were filled with small, illegible handwriting, but what surprised me the most was that these entries looked like a diary written in the first person, where someone described terrible crimes, murders, tortures, kidnappings. It was a confession, and the last entry was dated today. "We're on the right track," Jackson said, closing the bag. "But this diary is just the beginning. Whoever it is, he's playing with us." We were standing in the middle of the forest, holding this ominous diary that seemed to be the key to everything that was happening. But something inside me told me that this is just a trap, skillfully planned to drive us into a dead end. "We can't leave it here," Jackson said, closing the notebook. "But I don't think we can just leave like that. I feel like this maniac is controlling our every step." His words were true, and I felt paranoia wash over me. We have come into the light, but have we really left the darkness behind? And what to do when your opponent is someone who doesn't play by any rules? We got back to the car and I put the journal in the glove compartment, trying to hide my own shaking. As soon as Jackson started the engine, the forest was filled with strange sounds again, as if it had come to life after our intrusion. But now, we knew more than before, and that gave us a small chance. Returning to the main road, we discussed what to do next. It was clear that we were not dealing with a simple murderer, but with someone who enjoyed his crimes, someone who wants to get caught, but only on his terms. "We should go back to the station and study this diary," I suggested, trying to remain rational. "Perhaps there are clues there that will help us understand his motives." Jackson nodded, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes. He knew that this maniac was playing a game where the stakes were too high. But we had no choice. We had to go to the end. Returning to the city, we stopped at the branch. The night was quiet, and it felt wrong, as if the city was holding its breath before a storm. I opened the door and stepped out, feeling the cold air embrace me. We entered the building and headed for Jackson's office. There we opened the diary and started reading. There was only one sentence written on the first page that made me feel like the ground was slipping away from under my feet. "You think you're hunting me? No, I'm hunting you." The diary turned out to be something much worse than we expected. It was not just a collection of thoughts or confessions, but rather a plan of action, carefully thought out and written with a sick imagination. Every page was permeated with the desire to destroy everything we cherished. Jackson looked up from his notes and looked at me. "This is not just a maniac. This is someone who prepares thoroughly and enjoys every step. He knows what we are going to do and is several steps ahead of us." I looked at the diary again, feeling the dread wash over me. Each record was like a puzzle piece that we couldn't put together. But one thing was clear: this maniac doesn't just want us to find him. He wants us to feel terror, to be in a situation where there is no way out. "There's something important here," I said, pointing to one of the pages with an address. "This could be his hiding place or another trap." Jackson bent down and looked intently at the address. "This is an old warehouse outside the city. It was closed a long time ago, but the area is guarded." "That might be a chance," I replied, even though something inside me was screaming that this was a bad idea. "We have to take a chance," Jackson said firmly. "But we must be ready for anything." We took all the necessary equipment: weapons, bulletproof vests, flashlights. I could feel my heart start to beat faster as we got into the car. This night did not promise anything good, but we could not back down any longer. The road to the warehouse was quiet but tense. Every minute seemed like an eternity. Every shadow outside the window reminded us that we might never come back. When we got to the warehouse, there was no sign that anyone was there. The old rusted gate was closed, and silence reigned on the grounds. But we knew we were in for more than just an empty house. We carefully got out of the car and approached the gate. Jackson opened them with a heavy movement, and they creaked slightly. Inside, the warehouse looked abandoned, but I had the feeling that we had just crossed a line where something far more terrifying awaited. "Be ready," Jackson whispered as we walked inside. The darkness inside the warehouse was as thick as ink and seemed to absorb every sound. Our steps echoed, giving off dull echoes, as if we were in an infinite space where time did not exist. Jackson held the gun at the ready, and I held the flashlight, cutting through the darkness with a thin beam of light. The warehouse looked neglected and abandoned for many years. Dust covered the old equipment. Rusted structures stretched to the ceiling like the white bones of a giant beast. But it was not just a warehouse. It was a place where the ghosts of the past gathered, where every corner breathed death. We moved slowly, listening to every sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, someone invisible and insidious. Every time I turned, I thought something flickered in the shadows, but each time it was just a figment of my imagination. Suddenly, Jackson's flashlight caught something shiny on the floor. We got closer and saw a small metal object that seemed to be there on purpose. Jackson bent down and picked it up, examining it carefully. It was a small dictaphone. "What is it?" I asked, although the answer was obvious. Jackson pressed the play button, and a garbled voice cut through the speaker that seemed to be whispering to us from the depths of hell. "I know you're here. You think you're smarter than me? You think you can stop me? But I've been following you for a long time. I see your every move. You're already inside my world, and there's no way out." The voice fell silent, and we remained standing in absolute silence, exchanging glances. It was a signal. The maniac knew we were here, and it was part of his plan. "We have to find him," Jackson said firmly, hiding the recorder in his pocket. "We can't let him play with us." We moved on, carefully going around every corner of the warehouse, every shadowed space. But the deeper we plunged into the darkness, the more we felt fear taking hold of our thoughts. This place was his home, his realm of terror, where he controlled every aspect. Suddenly we heard a sound that made us freeze. It was like a silent cry coming from the depths of the warehouse. Jackson held up his hand to stop, and we obeyed. "It can't be him," Jackson whispered, listening for the sound. "But we have to check." We moved cautiously to the sound, which grew louder. When we reached the source of the sound, our hearts stopped. In front of us, in a small room overlooking the main hall of the warehouse, sat a young girl, bound and blindfolded. She sobbed softly, trying to move. Jackson approached her, trying not to scare her, and began to untie the ropes. But as soon as he touched her hand, her sobs stopped, and she slowly raised her head. Her eyes were wide, but there was nothing but emptiness in them. "He's here," she whispered, her voice changing to an ominous tone. "He was always here." Suddenly, the door behind us slammed, and we heard the sound of a shutter locking us in this room. The maniac was closer than we thought. As the door slammed shut behind us, I felt panic rising inside me. We found ourselves locked in a dark, damp room with no idea of what awaited us. Jackson instantly yanked on the doorknob, but they didn't budge. The room was small and poorly lit. The only light source was my flashlight, which cast a dim light on the walls. The girl, who had just been sitting silently, began to sob softly again. Her words echoed in my head. "He's always been here." Something in her voice made me shudder. It wasn't just fear. It was bone-chilling terror. "We have to find a way out," Jackson said, his voice calm, but I could tell he was nervous too. He scanned the room, looking for any sign or clue to our escape. I went to the girl, tried to calm her, but she continued to cry quietly, almost not noticing me. Her gaze was focused on one point, as if she saw something that we could not see. "Where is he?" I asked, trying to understand what was going on. "Do you know where he is hiding?" She slowly raised her head, her eyes as empty as a doll's. "He's everywhere. He's in you, in your head." Those words made me shudder. I stepped back, not knowing what to do. How could we fight against what we cannot see? Jackson, hearing her words, tensed up, but tried to keep his composure. Suddenly, in the corner of the room, we heard a metallic sound. Something heavy fell to the floor. We turned around and saw an ancient razor covered in rust and blood falling out of a crack in the wall. It was a clear sign left for us, but its meaning was too disturbing. Jackson walked over to the razor, picked it up, and examined it. "He left it here to scare us. He's playing with us." "Maybe that's the key," I said, pointing to the razor. "Perhaps she discovers something in this room." We began to search the walls, trying to find at least some clue. And so, in one of the corners of the room, I came across a small hole where a razor blade could be inserted. Jackson put it in there, and we heard the ominous click of the lock. The wall began to move, opening a narrow passage that led into an even darker room. But what awaited us there, no one knew. "We're moving on," Jackson said firmly, but I felt a chill run down my spine. We entered the passage, and when the wall behind us closed again, I knew there was no going back. The maniac led us further into his tent, and the game was just beginning. The passage we entered was so narrow that we could only advance one by one. The darkness around us deepened, and each step echoed with a dull sound, as if we were walking on bones. The flashlight weakly illuminated the path, but its beam seemed powerless in front of the darkness that engulfed us. "It looks like an underground tunnel," Jackson whispered, his gun at the ready. His voice came from deep, adding to the feeling of isolation. "This place seems endless," I replied, trying to quell my fear. Time seemed to have stopped, and we no longer knew how long we were walking, several minutes or hours. Jackson stopped and listened. We also froze, trying to catch even the slightest sound, but the silence was total, as if we were in a vacuum, where even our own breathing seemed like an echoing whisper. "We can't stop," Jackson said and moved on. His determination was obvious, but in his eyes I saw something new, a fear that penetrated even his confident shell. We kept walking until we noticed that the tunnel began to widen. The darkness was receding, and a faint glimmer of light appeared ahead. It was strange. Someone was waiting for us. "This could be a trap," I pointed out, but Jackson just nodded, not slowing his pace. We had no choice but to go forward. As we approached the light, a wide hall with high ceilings opened before us. It was lit by several old lamps that flickered like candles. In the center of the hall stood a large table, and on it was something that immediately caught our attention. On the table lay a map, spread out on a wooden surface. The map marked places we had already encountered, the warehouse where we are now, previous crime scenes, and even our station. But there was another mark, a place we had not yet explored. "This is a new location," Jackson whispered, staring intently at the map. "This place must be his ultimate goal." "Or so he wants us to think," I added, scanning the room carefully. "This could be another trap." "We've come too far to back down," Jackson replied firmly. "You have to go to the end." Suddenly there was a sound from behind the table. We turned and saw how one of the lamps suddenly crackled and went out. A few more lamps went out, and darkness began to cover the hall again. We immediately raised our weapons, but it was too late. Figures began to appear from the depths of the shadows, approaching us from all sides. They were human, but their faces were hidden by hoods and their movements stiff and unnatural. "Back!" Jackson shouted, but the only way out was blocked. We were trapped, and it was no accident. It was a game, and the maniac played by his own rules. Unidentified figures approached us, their faces hidden in the darkness. I could feel the sweat running down my back, and every muscle in my body was strained to the limit. Without hesitation, Jackson raised the gun and took aim, but before he could pull the trigger, a voice came from the shadows, cold and even. "No need to rush, Jackson. This is no place to shoot." A voice stopped us both. He was so familiar that my mind at first refused to believe what I was hearing. That voice belonged to someone we knew, but we couldn't figure out how he could be here. "Who are you?" Jackson shouted, keeping his gun pointed at one of the silhouettes. A man stepped slowly out of the shadows, whose face we only recognized when he got close enough. It was Lieutenant Marshall, our chief from the station. His calm demeanor and confidence gave the impression that he was not here by accident. "Marshall, what are you doing here?" I asked, but there was more suspicion than surprise in my voice. "It was only a matter of time until you got here," he replied, his voice remaining even, almost indifferent. "I knew you wouldn't stop until you knew the truth." "What truth?" Jackson was not going to lower his weapon. "What are you doing here with these people?" Marshall slowly raised his hands, demonstrating that he was unarmed. His gaze was serious, almost implacable. "It's not just a geek, it's not just a game. You're exploring more than you know." "Explain." My voice was strained. "Why are you here?" Marshall looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that scared me more than any maniac. It was the look of a man who no longer belonged to himself. "It's not my decision," he said quietly. "We're all just part of a plan we can't change." Suddenly, there was a loud sound from behind Jackson as someone from the darkness grabbed his arm, trying to wrestle the gun from him. I rushed to help, but the other figures also started to move. They surrounded us and we could not escape. Marshall raised his hand and everyone stopped. "There is no need for violence," he said, calmly approaching us. "I want you to understand that this is not your battle. Your role here is over." "I don't understand." Jackson took a step back, still holding his weapon, but his hand was shaking. "What do you mean?" Marshall leaned closer, his face dimly illuminated by the dim light of the lamp. "You found what you were looking for, but now it's time to leave this place." I felt panic rising inside me. There was something terrifying about his words, as if he knew we weren't going to get out of here alive. But we couldn't just give up. "You have a choice," Marshall continued. "You can leave now and we'll give you a chance. Or you can stay and this will be your end point." "We're not staying," Jackson said firmly, sensing that this was a trap. But Marshall just smiled, looking us up and down. "If this is your choice, then you must know there will be no going back." He turned and slowly walked back into the shadows, leaving us in the terrifying unknown. The silhouettes around us began to dissipate, as if losing their shape in the darkness. We were left alone, again in this merciless silence. Jackson lowered the gun and I felt my heart start beating faster again. We didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear. We were no longer just hunters. We became prey. "We can't stay here," I said, but Jackson looked lost in thought. "We have to find a way out." But the exit now seemed something illusory, and Marshall's shadow hung over us like an inevitable sentence. As the silhouettes dissolved into the darkness, I felt fear begin to take over logic. It was a trap, and we fell deeper into it than we could have imagined. Jackson stood in silence, his gaze fixed on the spot where Marshall had just disappeared. I could see his hand shaking, though he tried to hide it. "We can't stay here, Jackson," I reminded, trying to bring him back to reality. "Marshall is just distracting us. It's all part of his plan." Jackson nodded slowly, but I could see the struggle in his eyes. He was trying to gather his thoughts, to understand what was happening. "Marshall was always on our side. How did this happen? Why did he—" "Well, figure it out later. We need to get out of here now." I looked around, looking for some way out of this creepy room. Our steps were cautious, like those of hunters who do not want to frighten their prey. We knew that any sound could attract the attention of those hiding in the dark. But now we understood that Marshall was not just one of them. He was the main threat. We came to the opposite end of the hall, where there was another heavy wooden door, half closed. Jackson pressed it and slowly opened it. Behind the door opened another narrow corridor, lit only by dim lamps that flickered on the walls. "He's taking us somewhere," I whispered. "He wants us to move on." "Then we'll go," Jackson decided, raising his gun. His resolve returned, though I could see he was on the edge too. We moved forward, passing through a corridor that seemed endless. Every step sounded like a heartbeat, and every sound made us tense up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that we were part of something terrible that was just beginning. At the end of the corridor, we came across a small staircase leading down. The air here was even more damp and heavy, and the darkness seemed thicker. The flashlight barely illuminated the walls covered with fungus and rust. Below was another door that led to an even deeper basement. "Are we sure we want to go there?" I asked, but Jackson had already opened the door. Behind them, we found something we could not expect. There were several tables in the basement, on which lay old police files, photographs, and documents. All this was covered with dust, as if no one had touched them for a long time. But among the papers, we saw something that made us shudder. On one of the tables was a photo card of a younger Marshall from when he was just beginning his career. But the biggest horror was caused by something else. In the background of the photo was the same maniac we had been looking for so long. He was next to Marshall, and they were smiling at each other like old friends. It can't be. Jackson took the photo and examined it carefully. That was years ago. Marshall knew him, my words choked. He was involved with it from the beginning. Jackson tossed the photo on the table and looked at the other documents. They had details of the cases we were investigating, names, dates, places of crimes. Everything was collected here, as in a grotesque album of memories. He's been playing with us all these years, I said, feeling rage start to replace fear. Marshall was part of it all. He was helping him, and we were his pawns, Jackson added quietly, but his voice broke at the end. He looked at me again, and I saw in his eyes not only anger, but also disappointment. It all became clear now that we were just part of a bigger plan, part of the game Marshall was playing with the maniac. And now that we know the truth, there's only one option left for us: to find Marshall and stop him, even if it means plunging us deeper into this nightmare. After we found those horrible documents in the basement, we knew the game wasn't over yet. Marshall continued to manipulate us, and now we had to decide how to stop this terrible plan. We left the basement and returned to the main hall. But now we knew that our every move was planned and controlled. Marshall always seemed to be one step ahead. We had to act quickly. We have to find him before he escapes or starts a new phase of his game, Jackson said, trying to stay calm. I nodded, believing that we could do it, even if it required a great sacrifice. We returned to the main hall and headed to a new marker on the map where we hoped Marshall was. It was an old, abandoned factory located on the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect place for the final battle. Leaving the car a few blocks from the factory, we walked to it. The sky above us was gloomy, and the rain began to drizzle. This created an additional atmosphere of horror. Every step we took was careful, because we knew that Marshall could be waiting for us. The factory was even creepier inside. Next to coiled wires and old cars, it seemed that this is where the final scene of our tragedy unfolded. We entered the darkness that reigned within. We can't go forward without a plan, Jackson said, and I agreed. Suddenly we heard the sound of footsteps. It was no ordinary sound. It was a sound coming from every direction. Something was moving in the darkness. She was there, and we could feel it coming. Then a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was Marshall, but he looked wasted and mentally intolerable. You made me play this game to the end. His voice was flat and cold. I can't be stopped just like that. Enough already, Jackson shouted, trying to impress Marshall, but suddenly the doors of the factory are closed and we are trapped. You had to understand that it was always going to be the end game, Marshall said. It was all just a test. We struggled to get out of the trap, but each attempt only deepened our fears. Eventually, after a fierce struggle, Jackson and I were able to beat the trap Marshall had set for us. We found a way to bypass his mechanisms and come forward. Why did you do that? I asked as we approached Marshall. What were you trying to achieve? It wasn't about defeating you, Marshall replied, his voice softening as if he had already been defeated. It was about proving that anyone can be a part of this game, even if you think you're outside of it. Jackson, his heart seems to have slowed down. You didn't win, Marshall. Your game is over. The moment we apprehended Marshall and handed him over to the police, we felt a huge sense of relief. The game he played was finally over. When we returned to normal life, a sense of normality seemed far away and out of reach. We have been through hell, and although we have found our freedom again, the memories of this nightmare will stay with us forever. The game is over, but its echo will remain with us forever. And even when we tried to forget the horrors we had experienced, the knowledge that at any moment could become part of another terrible test did not leave us.